on you.
Okay. Well, maybe I'll take this opportunity after, of course, thanking everybody for tuning in and to make note of the bizarre situation that we're all in, tuning in this kind of a way. And we have one person in New Orleans, it's John Clark, another person in New Gegoda in Sri Lanka. You can see my map in the back there. And then we're converging in New York. So this is exercise in internationalism. And we want to thank everybody for tuning in. And we really do hope, sorry that we can't see you, but please do write your questions in there. And we look forward to responding to them as best we can. My mission today is in previous conversations John has asked me to do, is really to just keep up with John. I think he's one of the most important minds in our generation that I've met. And this book is really magisterial. It covers a huge range. And there's no way we're going to be able to cover it all in the sense that it touches on so many geographies, so many theories, so many things. So I'm just my questions are going to be focused on a couple things. I thought as a way of introducing people to this book, I would read the blurb that I wrote for PM Press, which they only picked a small part of. I sort of wrote a longer thing. But if that's all right, I'll just sort of introduce the book with this blurb, if that's okay with you, John.
Oh, whatever you would like to do. I think it's a great idea.
Okay, so look at this. The guy who I'm talking about is right in front of you, everybody. A magus of the Meseshabe stands here between earth and empire. This book is a compass, polarized in the superlative subtropiques of the Gulf Coast, orienting cardinal points in the landscapes of the Zapatistas, the Black Panther Party, the Kurdish Freedom Movement, and West Papua. These particular grounds are triangulated by the universal eras of Zen Buddhism, Taoism, and Sufism. Read John Clark and become an anarchist all over again, even if you didn't know you were one until now. From the secret co-founder of Surregionalism, here is a magazine of manifestos to turn the world not only upside down, but inside out. And with minds and hearts awakened into care, we are all invited on a quest to save the world and to save ourselves. We'll leave behind the morbid symptoms of COP21 in Paris, or the 10th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, and we'll celebrate a return to such magnificent sources as the 500th birthday of Utopia and the summer solstice. These are all subjects that John covers in his book. This guy is a monk and a dervish of the way that is not the way. He's a heavyweight philosopher of East and West, a knight errant of trauma and joy, and he binds all of these essays together with his laughter at the epigones of empire and his love for the communities of the earth. Maybe I'll stop there because I'm going on too long and I'll embarrass John with my superlatives. This book is—
By the way, thank you, Quincy. And I don't know if I've ever seen the unabridged version of your blurb. However, I have to say that I gave you a blurb that I didn't know was going to be a blurb, which is probably the ultimate blurb. I don't know if you want to tell people what I said.
Yeah, that's true. Well, for the Maroon Comix, you know, I think it worked because I asked him to make a comment, and he said, you know, I think he was commented on the subject of the book more than on the book itself. On this book about the history of Maroons, he wrote, "This is the best thing in the history of the world."
No, I meant your book.
Sorry?
Never mind.
You meant the book. Oh, okay.
Anyway, it turned out to be a blurb, which I thought was, you know, I think you made good use of my comment.
Thank you, John. Well, without going on too much about the personalities, let's get into the subject here. And this book is so broad that I want to just begin with what's right on the cover. It seems like a safe place to begin, which is the largest gold mine in the world and the second largest copper mine in the world. And it's in West Papua, and it's run by the Freeport-McMoRan Corporation. There we go. Thanks for holding that up. So let me say something about this. Freeport-McMoRan, John Clark got involved with this struggle because Freeport-McMoRan was dumping a bunch of waste in the Mississippi Delta. And as a side note, they've had a role in the country where I am right now as well. They had a role in a phosphate mine, which was in the Epawala region of Sri Lanka, which was actually reversed. It's a positive story about a beloved community where there was a coalition of trade union leaders and Buddhist monks and environmentalists and feminists all came together and stopped them from coming in. So I want to just read some quotes, because I think that what's on the cover of the book really illustrates what your whole book is about, and then I'm going to turn it over to you. I'm going to read some quotes from Jim Bob Moffett, CEO of Freeport-McMoRan, as you've written in your book. He wrote about this mining operation and all they were doing there. He wrote, "This is not a job for us, it's a religion." He went on to say, "We are thrusting a spearhead of development into the heartland." And in case that's not specific enough for you, he said, "We are mining the esophagus." When people in West Papua organized to stop this operation, what Freeport-McMoRan put about $1 million towards what was literally called Operation Annihilation, to suppress the struggle of the people there. You characterize Freeport-McMoRan in your book as tactically, what do you say? Tactically inept, but strategically efficient. In the sense you were able in certain ways to expose them. And we see this a lot around the world today. There are a lot of people, individuals, and corporations that we know about all the bad stuff they're doing, and we can expose them, but they're still running the show. So I'd just like to introduce the subject of the book by what's on the cover, and having given the listeners that insight into what's going on in West Papua and your involvement in it, I'd like you to tell us a little bit more about the subject of your book.
Yeah, I absolutely did not think you were going to start with that, and I'm really glad you did. I mean, I love the fact that you did. And often when I talk about texts, I say that it's very important to begin at the beginning. With a lot of text, if you do, for instance, in the Impossible Community, if you read the first paragraph or two of the preface, you'll know more about what the book is about than some people might by reading much of the book. And you really did go to the beginning. You went, and I was so happy that PM Press put that picture on the book. I spent 10 years of my life very heavily involved in the issue of West Papua and really working on it every day. The company, we call it Freeport-McMoRan, is the Louisiana pronunciation, but they were endowing environmental chairs at all major regional universities. So I got involved in a fight to try to prevent the university from taking basically $1 million. Needless to say, they took the $1 million, but we fought for about a year, and we went through transformations by being engaged in the struggle. And I think particularly in the case of a lot of students who had not been heavily engaged in political struggles before, it was really a transformational thing in their life. And I came to admire the students so much. The faculty did not support the fight. The faculty retreated in fear when the president of the university started threatening, maybe taking action against faculty and students. But there were very courageous students in one case who had to face death threats, and there was a lot of harassment. In one case, the president of the university called an assembly and singled out one activist student and ridiculed her in front of a large assembly of students. I mean, it was a very difficult thing for young people to go through. And I was very proud of them and felt very fortunate to work with them for those years. And the story is amazing. At times I felt as if I was living in a novel. I mean, particularly this guy, Jim Bob Moffett, the CEO of this huge corporation, $5 billion corporation, partner of Rio Tinto, RTZ, RTZ, it goes under various names, the largest mining corporation in the world. This was our opponent, a rather formidable opponent. And he was a very bizarre character. To me, he was like a character from a novel, as if someone were going to do a satire on cowboy capitalism.
Right.
And during the struggle, the Papuans brought suits against the corporation in state and federal court in Louisiana. It was very difficult to go into Papua to do work for, in fact, people were thrown out. If you tried to go there and support the Papuans, you would be expelled from the country, which was a small penalty compared to what was happening to the Papuans, who were victims of the worst terrorism and certainly cultural genocide, and in many cases, attempts at actual genocide. At one point, Tom Bienal, who was the head of the Amungme Tribal Council, came to New Orleans for the suit. I got to meet some, this really transformed my politics, by the way, completely in the early 90s. I had been involved in very, I would say, okay, I have to say it, a very Eurocentric political movement for quite a while. And the 90s were the turning point in my life in that area. And working with the Papuans was so important to that transformation, my own educational process, my own giving up of a lot that I had been attached to for a long time. And also Mama Yosefa Alamang, the most prominent woman in the Amungme tribe, also came to Louisiana for the suit. And both of them gave talks at Loyola University. We were very fortunate. I don't know if they had ever done any presentations in the United States before. But during Tom Bienal's presentation, he talked about the cosmology of the Papuans and how the island of Papua was thought of as basically a divine mother, symbolically, or maybe let's say really, for the Papuans. The earth was sacred and the earth was their mother. So there's a material aspect to all of this. The sacred has a material aspect.
Mater, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, in the book, I think it's we're supposed to be talking about these two books, but I think it's in this one where I suggest a theory we could call dialectical maternalism, yeah. Which kind of, brings that concept in of the material and the maternal and the dialectic between them. Well, in his speech at Loyola, he talked about the cosmology and how the mountains near where the mine is, or where the mine is near Tamika in West Papua, this was considered where the heart of the mother was located. So to me, it would take a good novelist really to present this sort of thing, to come up with a CEO who could say something like, we are thrusting a spearhead of development into the heartland of Irian Jaya, which is the Indonesian name that he used for West Papua. But that's what he said. So it's quite amazing to me. Yeah. Why don't you? We could go in many directions.
Yeah, no, fine. Thank you, John. I think I would recommend for people who are new to John Clark, this book is sort of a series of windows into almost your whole adult life, if not earlier. And you've done a lot of other things as well. But we could easily, I would recommend this book deserves study groups over months, because we could talk this whole time about West Papua. But I don't want to neglect so many of the other themes, which range from, Zapatistas and Rojava Revolution to a lot of just theories and ideas that accompany these struggles.
Could I say one more thing about it, the way you're formulating it? We have these cliches like, think globally, act locally, or you could do variations on that. Think locally, act globally. Think locally, act locally. Think globally, act globally. I mean, once you start doing one, you see the need to do all of them. And one of the, I originally got involved in the Papua issue by getting involved in the struggle against the dumping of radioactive gypsum into the Mississippi River, which is an ecosystem and is also our water supply. And I very quickly discovered that the atrocities of the corporation Freeport-McMoRan in Louisiana and also in Austin, Texas, and other places were horrendous, but in a sense minuscule compared to what was being done in West Papua and the kind of atrocities that were taking place. So very quickly, I saw that, for instance, when Freeport-McMoRan sponsored a golf tournament, or they put their name on the Boy Scout headquarters, or they endowed the main theater at the Contemporary Arts Center in New Orleans, that all of this wealth that was being poured into PR, basically, in greenwashing, endowing environmental chairs at LSU, Tulane, Loyola, at University of New Orleans, this was all being extorted from the Papuan people. And they were sacrificing their lives and their blood and their labor, usually very menial labor, because the higher paid labor was given to other people. When you walked in, and in fact, I was actually teaching in a classroom called the Freeport-McMoRan Video Classroom.
Holy shit, really?
I was doing distance learning way back when this was first coming in, and in a way, it was scandalous, but in another sense, it was a very good thing, because every time I taught a course in that classroom, I got a chance to talk about where the money to endow, to create that classroom came from. So it was quite a lesson in the relation between the global and the local. And also I had to get into how politics, in fact, the Democratic senator of that time, John Breaux, was the major defender of Freeport-McMoRan. And there were also all kinds of international organizations, for instance, the organization that insured companies against losses in cases of internal conflict and so forth was involved. So I had to learn a lot that I could never have learned. And of course, learning from the Papuans about their cosmology and about indigenous society was perhaps the most important thing that I learned. So at the beginning of that book, I wrote I think it's a preface or a foreword subtitled, I think, Notes of a Slow Learner.
Yeah.
Something like that.
That's it.
Yeah, it's Lessons from the School of Radical Change, Notes of a Slow Learner. And Peter Marshall, who wrote the introduction, said this was an ironic comment, but it wasn't an ironic comment. It was a real comment about how difficult it is to learn these things and the kind of barriers that we have to awakening to so many areas of reality. So, I mean, there isn't a kind of, just doing it as a preface is kind of ironic, just, to start out a book saying, but I developed a concept called respect for my own stupidity, which I also, I have to credit Buddhist philosophy for this also, because, in Buddhist philosophy now for 2,500 years, there's been the idea that our mind constantly trips us up. And of course, it's not only the mind, but the mind is interconnected with every other aspect of our being and being beyond what we call our being. And there's so many aspects of that trip us up. And therefore, the most important, one of the things that I owe to Zen is the whole idea that everything is practice. And that, our practice, at least I'll speak for myself, my practice is so bad. But it's important to know how bad your practice is, because then you know how hard you have to work on it. And of course, out of that came this theory about the social institutional structure, the social imaginary, the social ideology, and the social ethos, and all the areas that shape us into what we are, and also create all the barriers to what we could be collectively.
Wow, beautiful, John. There's a lot of wisdom there. I hope we can, when this is recorded, we can rewind and listen to that little piece again. That's a good transition for me to ask you about something in a different chapter of your book about education. And in a way, this gets at the heart. You've already started this story, telling your own story. But in a way, this gets at the heart of your praxis as a person. Of what you call living the questions. You've had 45 years of experience in higher education, mostly in philosophy, but 27 years in environmental sciences. But you also worked at the other end of the learning spectrum in co-op preschools and a Montessori school. And you've also done high school teaching and study abroad programs. So it's a big range of things there. One of the quotes I wanted to pull out, and I think you've just given a fantastic example about it, so I'm not going to ask you for the example, I'm going to ask you something else, but something you say in the book is that education must provoke a crisis of selfhood. It must involve trauma. This is not the usual pedagogy we are taught about when we study education. You are talking about something very different. And I'd like to reframe this question in the context of the elephant that we're all trapped in the room with, which is the coronavirus pandemic. I heard recently that there's 1.6 billion school-age children. So some of them, depending on the country, are going to school now. But we can safely say that about probably over 1 billion children are not going to school right now. There's a global crisis of selfhood. There is a global form of education going on, if you want to call it that, involving trauma. And it's very different. Everybody passes through the portal of the pandemic in different ways. But I want to ask you to reflect on, you have several essays in this book about education, but could you, for me and for all the listeners, reflect on how do we summon up the distilled lessons about education in this bizarre context that we're in right now, where everything is from a distance, where we're sort of never more connected yet never more isolated. Tell us about education and trauma and the coronavirus pandemic.
That was a very wide-ranging question and summary of things. You started out with different experiences that I had, and maybe we could start with just practice in general, and maybe look at some examples of how such things work, and then see how this might be I really think this would be a good question. We're going to leave a half hour, I think, for general discussion.
Sure, and maybe John, let me clarify it a little bit. I think a lot of people right now I hear saying save our schools, and
right.
A lot of how can we get things started again? But I think how can we use the insights you've gathered, which is that to see trauma, to see a challenge to the selfhood as a form of education, how can we see this moment as an opportunity? How can these billion children right now take this? How can the parents of these billion children use this as kind of the moment that we've been waiting for, rather than as something that we lament and just hope to get rid of as soon as possible?
Right. Okay. To begin with, I think we have to look at every moment as the moment we've been waiting for. Okay. One of the most powerful educational experiences that I've been involved in is our India program. And I mentioned I decided to wear the T-shirt from our India program in Dharamsala and other places in India in your time zone. It's a very traumatic experience for students because they're in a different world. um, American students have never, they have some concepts of what the world is about, but they have never visited villages in Asia before. They've never seen the kind of oppressive poverty and deprivation in the midst of a very wealthy world that they see when they go to India. In our program, and I have to do this slowly, I can't really talk in generalities about something like how education works and what is the formula to apply this to a particular, but just to give some examples, each student is paired up with a learning partner who in our program was a Tibetan refugee living in India. So in other words, a person from a poor country, a country that's been a victim of invasion, oppression, genocide, living as a refugee in another very poor country with severe social, economic problems and political problems, let's say. Also, we could talk about that if you'd like. So in a certain sense, this is traumatic to the student. The trauma of seeing, for instance, what everybody talks about, the level of poverty in India, in big cities, in the megalopolises. So we go to Delhi first before we end up in Dharamsala, which is such a contrast also. Spending many, many hours with a person who is a refugee in a poor country is a traumatic experience. And a lot of our students are traumatized when they see the difference between the problems that the Tibetan refugees are dealing with and the problems that the average American student is dealing with. And there's always a question of how can the Tibetans maintain the kind of, I don't want to use cliches, but the kind of peace, in a sense, and stability in their life that they have. Why are they not more unhappy is the question that our students often have. And this opens up the possibility of looking at what practice, for instance, the Tibetans might participate in, and also what it means to have a community, a very strong community, and a community of mutual aid, really. So there are tremendous learning opportunities there. That's just one example. When I started teaching, I was trained in a typical graduate school, in an environment that had very little connection to the world, indirect connections, and for my first 35 years, I taught working class people in an adult education program at night. So actually, when the first job I got, I was still in graduate school, I had 2 kids, et cetera. I walked into an office and said, would you give me a job? They said, okay, you can teach 4 or 5 courses a semester 3 times a year for nothing, basically. And I was thrown into a situation where I was teaching people in business programs, later on, a lot of nurses, which was a wonderful experience, a lot of people in criminal justice. I had to teach a lot of police, a lot of people in computer science and so forth. So the idea of what are we going to do with philosophy with the people who were sitting here in this room, that was quite, this is why I can say things like slow learner. It took me a long time to figure out what we really needed to talk about and what we really needed to do. When my kids were very young, 2, 3, 4 years old, I didn't have a real job. My ex-wife didn't have a real job. We helped start a co-op preschool. And a lot of parents who really had no resources got together and created their own educational institution, basically. Maybe 50, well, maybe 30 families to begin with. We started our own parent-teacher preschool in which there was a teacher and a parent volunteer in every class. So since my ex-wife was actually teaching full-time in another cooperative preschool, I worked in the co-op preschool 1 day a week. And I mean, that was not what I had trained for in graduate school, but in many ways, I learned more from those 3-year-olds. I guess you're beginning to discover this educational experience that I had. In a way, that was not something I expected. But this is why, you know, basically every moment is the moment of learning. You know, I mean, there's this cliche that I hate so much, a teachable moment. Well, everything is a moment of learning and teaching or teaching yourself. So the question is, what is our mentality? What is our sensibility when we go into that moment? And you know, one of the most famous books on Zen is Suzuki's book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. And in a sense, it is beginner's mind. I mean, of course, technique is important, and learning from the past is important. Learning from our own experience is important, but also being open to that moment. I mean, all of this we can apply to the pandemic. We're being thrown into something we didn't expect. We go into it with all sorts of preconceptions. I mean, we can ask, how does our mind work? Our mind works in situations that we are now not facing. We are facing a situation in which the parameters, the variables have changed significantly. I think we have to ask ourselves about this. I mean, we can ask ourselves philosophical questions, ontological questions. In what way is our mode of being changing? Because life is changing and the challenges of life are changing. So these are a few ideas to throw out anyway about how we might begin to try to answer that question.
Right. Thanks so much, John. That was very profound. Again, everybody, we will go back and rewind and listen to that again and send them to I'll send it to my nieces who are not going to high school right now. And there's a whole audience for this stuff that we have.
Well, I mean, you know, I mean, you're obviously posing more and more questions because it raises the question: if you're a parent and children are at home, you know, what are you going to do? That's throwing you into the position of being a kind of educator, taking on more of the responsibility of education than you had planned on. But also that can, you know, just to draw one parallel, that could be a great opportunity, which is what happened with the preschool that I worked in. It was, you know, it was not something a year before I had been aware of, but it threw me into the position of being, well, collectively responsible for the education of my children in a way that I might not have been.
Right.
And this whole thing shook up my ideas about people, about sex roles. One of the things we were really questioning at that time was there were a few writers who were doing incredible work in feminist theory at that time about the fact that early childhood socialization was so much, you know, we might have said relegated to women because it was considered an inferior kind of thing. But, you know, what would a society be like in which everyone took on the responsibilities of early childhood education, nurturing? You know, how could this change our sensibilities, particularly how could it challenge our conceptions of masculinity and our dualities and oppositions that we falsely create within the self and within society? So it created sort of utopian expectations at that time about how we would transform education. I was very heavily in the early 70s involved in the alternative education movement. We had two huge alternative education conferences in New Orleans that basically were organized by graduate students who convinced universities to give them a lot of money to bring all kinds of people in because it was a fad at that time. But we had very unrealistic expectations. And then there was a tremendous amount of disillusionment when we saw much of this collapse. And I could go into more detail about that, but in many ways we saw the male role in childhood development decreasing in many sectors of our society, and a kind of abdication of responsibility by a whole generation or more of young males. And this was a very traumatic thing. I mean, we really expected a huge movement in which men would want to be more involved in early childhood development of their own children and the children of the community. And this just did not happen. So this means we have to reflect on what we did that was right and what we did that was wrong. And we had sort of delusions about how free schools and alternative education would develop, and cooperative preschools and all of these things. We didn't really know how to do it, but we knew it was the right thing, and I still believe it was the right thing. And I think a lot of our personal development, you know, collectively has been, there's been an enormous obstacle in that this development has not continued.
Right. Thanks, John. There's so much here, and I'm always tempted to just go deeper into that, but I feel like in order to do justice to this book that we're talking about today, I'm obliged to move us around to many different sites of struggle and many different points. And you know, as people who are just meeting John for the first time digitally are getting a sense of your how deeply you feel about these things, how deeply you've thought about them. The sort of poignant mix of both humility, but also fortitude with which you're confronting these profound questions. So with that said, I'm going to move to a different hot topic that you cover in your book, which is a second look, or not a second look, another look at the Black Panther Party. This is something that I think has changed the world. Something the Black Panther Party, you know, had a global effect, but in very recent times, this legacy is in the news again, not just in the United States through Black Lives Matter, but it's really a global phenomenon. It's changed. I've seen this from South Africa to Sri Lanka to places around the world. The Black Lives Matter movement and the insurrections, which have been blossoming across the United States. I know there's a lot of complexities, but they've changed the global conversation. And I thought it might be interesting to revisit this essay you wrote about the legacy of the Panthers in the context, again, of the coronavirus pandemic. One of the things you mentioned is that the Black Panther Party had a People's Medical Care Center. This is not one of the things that's usually front and center when you hear about it. You talk about how they had 10 doctors, 12 nurses, 2 medical technicians, volunteer interns from local medical schools, and they treated over 100 patients a week. That's just one piece of what they were doing. But then another side of it, you know, it wasn't just, you know, giving talks, you know, it was, they had armed patrol cars with law books and guns that they would go around neighborhoods and patrol. And I think one of the things that I want to focus on, I want to invite you to make any comments about the Black Lives Matter movement today and the legacy of the Panthers in New Orleans. You talk all about that in your essay, and I want you to go into that. But there's one sentence in this essay which I think really resonated. I just shared it with someone recently in Sri Lanka, and they were like, "Oh, send me that quote." So I think it'll resonate with many people. You write that paradoxically, it is by becoming more radically local that a movement is likely to spread far beyond its boundaries. Say more about that, and say more about that, and reflect on the Black Revolution, which is returned to the United States.
Yeah, well, this is a big part of what the book is about. And I know we're going to have to wrap up our part pretty soon, but I think the discussion of the Sarvodaya movement in India and also Sarvodaya Shramadana in Sri Lanka are two of the most important parts of the book. And basically the Sarvodaya in India, the so-called Gandhian movement, is very much based on the village. And we could go into that. There's a lot of evidence, and two of the key chapters are on Rojava and Chiapas, which I wish we had a chance to talk about. But one of the questions I've had is, when we look for examples, really good examples, things we can learn from, places we can learn from, people we can learn from, we come up with examples like Rojava or Chiapas, but what is there, for instance, in the United States? And I think it's important to have some closer to home examples also. And right now, when I want to give a third example after Rojava and Chiapas, I give Cooperation Jackson as the example, which happens to be not far from where I am. And I wish we had, right, very good. I hope people will look into what Cooperation Jackson is doing and also become a supporter of Cooperation Jackson. But if we look back into relatively recent history of during my lifetime, certainly the Black Panthers are important for many reasons. A friend of mine and I are doing a comic, by the way, called Anarchy in the Big Easy, which is a history of radical and revolutionary movements and activities in New Orleans. And I think probably the best chapter is one on the shootout between the Black Panther. Basically, they were shot at by the police in the Desire Project, in which my friend Malik Rahim was one of the key figures in the events leading up to that and during and after. So the Black Panthers played an important role in our local New Orleans radical history, but very few people know the communitarian dimension of the Black Panther organization in Oakland, and how much went on in the area of service to the community, educational programs, lunch programs, medical programs, etc. And also the kind of personal transformation that was going on among young men, primarily, who had been socialized into a very alien culture in many ways, the dominant culture, and who were creating a culture of their own, a culture of self-transformation that was undoing many of the worst features of American culture. And that people were beginning to work together and cooperate and create communal institutions in a way that was extraordinary, I think, for anything in American culture. So it's a lesson that I think people have to look at very, very closely, because of course the media, the mass media, focused only on the most sensationalistic aspects of conflicts between the Panthers and the police and so forth, and didn't really pay attention to the constructive developments that were going on.
Right.
And I also think it's always important to look at the history, the Black liberation movement's history in relation to the present. And in Cooperation Jackson, there's a long history going back 40 years at least with the Republic of New Africa movement, which was going on at the same time as the Panthers and never died, just like the Black Panthers movement never died. It's still alive. And basically Common Ground, which was certainly the most impressive, strongly anarchist influenced movement and organization in recent history in the United States, would not have existed if it had not been for the Black Panther background and Malik Rahim transmitting that to us at that time. Well, right now that history is still alive in Cooperation Jackson, and I think people need to look at the institutions that are being created, the solidarity economy that's being created, and so forth in Jackson. So it's a living history is basically the story, I think.
Thank you, John. Just a question, should we start taking questions from folks, or shall I keep throwing you easy, difficult questions, or
well, originally, I think we had said we'd try to leave a half hour, if possible, for other people to interact, and we're down to 25 minutes.
Okay. So folks,
we can certainly go a few minutes over, but yeah, might be a good time to migrate over to the comments.
Okay, so I'm looking through the comments now, and it's great to see a lot of engagement. I'm not seeing specific questions. So if folks who haven't weighed in yet have a question, or if you've posted one and I've not noticed it, please let us know.
I'm gonna, we have a raised hand, and I'm gonna allow this person to talk.
Great.
Hola, cucaracha. Hey, so can you just speak more about the problematic of maternity and materiality? It's something I think about a lot. You began your presentation talking about this metaphorics of the male CEO plunging his whatever it is into the earth, and then you just describe this like vivid like rape, violation, violence of the earth and against community on the one hand, and then on the positive note you talk about the reconstruction and of community, the reconstruction of nurturing roles for men and for women, and so just could you just please bring out the family and the gender dynamics of your analysis here? Thank you.
Well, I think the best way to do that might be to go to, in a sense, is what is the central point of the book, of both of the books that we were touching on, which is what do we do? Where do we go from here? And the book is not about something abstract. It's about in the first book at the beginning. If I could just maybe read a passage and go in that direction, that this book is about the quest for the free community, the community of liberation and solidarity. It seeks to convey the message that we need to think more deeply and carefully about the meaning of free community and the obstacles that stand in the way of its realization. Above all, it seeks to convey the message, create it now. And those were the first lines of the book. And one of the things that's disappointed me a bit is that I haven't heard from a lot of people who have sent back a message saying, well, let's get together and work on creating it now. Yeah. And one of the things I liked about all of a sudden having two young kids who needed something more than being stuck at home all the time was to create a cooperative environment, a cooperative milieu where we could do things together as a community. And it's the word I guess we haven't mentioned yet is care. And one of the things that has influenced me and I've thought about a lot is the ethics of care and ecofeminism, and not only the ethics of care, but the politics of care. That we really need a politics of care, that we need a one thing that I've thought about a lot over the years is what would a political movement be like if your membership were not like to have a membership card or to become a member of a party or become a member of some kind of organization, but that everyone would be part of an affinity group in the strongest sense, or a base community. Another thing that I mention in these books a lot is the base communities in Latin America. There have been hundreds of thousands of them that have been so important to the political and social and economic transformations in Latin America that are, of course, now being reversed in many cases. But it took a lot of work and a lot of sacrifices, a lot of lives for those achievements, a lot of deaths. Of people who fought for liberation and solidarity. So to me, the big step is to create small communities, to create affinity groups, to create base communities, to create small institutions in which we can practice what we are trying to create. In some ways, I question the concept of prefiguration, because it says that there's something in the future that we're going to give a kind of example of so that we can somehow get to that future. But in many ways, I like the concept of transfiguration, that we're doing it now, that we're transforming ourselves, we're transforming our small groups, our communities, our families. So this to me would be the big question. What can we do right now? What kind of community can we create? And I mentioned, I think before we officially started, that I was looking at the news on France 24 this morning, and there was a very good, very disturbing documentary called Kibbutz Revisited, which was about a particular kibbutz that had been totally privatized. And at one point, the reporter said, she actually said this, capitalism is everywhere. and went into someone's house and like, we put in a big kitchen. We used to have a tiny little kitchen. Now we have our own big kitchen. We do everything ourselves. There were some old people in a kind of cafeteria. They were saying, well, now you have to do everything yourself. There are no volunteers who serve you, pick up things. You do everything yourself and you pay for everything. And you know, this was, to me, this was crushing. I mean, there was a great dream there that Martin Buber, a great libertarian socialist thinker, had of the what he called the full cooperative, which was the cooperative of production, consumption, and living together. And this is what is being disassembled and has been disassembled. Oh, another thing in the documentary that I thought was amazing, that one person was talking about all the things that the kibbutz did and basically said, once the state was created, the state took over all of this. So we didn't have to do it anymore, basically. I mean, it was amazing that this was explicitly said. It was almost like history recapitulated, you know, that once the state was created, we don't have to do it anymore. But of course, what we did is no longer being done, is the suppressed part of that statement. And then there was also an interview with, I'm sorry to wander this way, but this struck me, you know, the question is about what do we do, I suppose, and this is about what many tried to do and has been reversed. There was a group of 100 people who tried to form an urban kibbutz, and you know, they had to vote on how to do it, and only 9 out of 100 wanted to pool resources. So in a sense, you know, they were rejecting the whole, you know, to be a real community is what they were rejecting, what Martin Buber called the full cooperative. So if we want to learn how to transform ourselves, how to transform the roles of parents or even non-parents in child raising, and how to question the dualistic conceptions we have of gender and sex roles and so forth, the way we have to do it is by start doing it. We have to do it as a community. We have to become part of a community whose goal is to engage in that kind of practice. So
Fantastic.
That's the best I can do.
Thank you, John. There's another question here that came in that can segue easily, I think, from our good friend, Taryn Giacomini, who we all met at the same time. And she wanted you to, I know it's hard to do this briefly, But she says, if you could talk a little bit about the influence of indigenous feminism and matriarchy on your work, particularly the Zapatista and Rojava expressions. I'll just do a little bit of a intro just because I've done
I wish
studied
you
it.
would. You know so much about some of these things. Yeah.
So, but I think you'll synthesize it. But I just sort of, for people who aren't familiar, as an introduction, in both of these cases, we're talking about movements in southern Mexico and in Kurdistan. There was the origins are this group of are guerrilla groups that were started in the late 60s, early 70s. In Kurdistan, it was the Kurdish Workers' Party. And in Mexico, it was the Forces of National Liberation, the FLN, who went into the mountains and started to do their sort of Marxist-Leninist, Maoist, guerrilla, FOCO, Che Guevara strategy, right? And a strange thing happened is that there was, to cut a long story short, there were revolutions within the revolution in both places. This happened in the 1980s, roughly, where women in both of these places sort of staged a political revolution within their organizations and took power in the sense of there in the Zapatistas. This was reflected in the revolutionary laws of women, which enumerated the different ways in which women had equal rights and were able to participate in all political decisions and were able to, have children or not have children, or, the full list that people can look up, the list of revolutionary laws of women. And in Kurdistan, this actually resulted in the formation of even a separate military wing, the YPJ, which is a separate command structure from the co-ed guerrilla force. And there's much more to be said about this, but both of these revolutionary movements, who definitely know about each other and to some degree are in touch, but definitely don't coordinate, aren't in the capacity to coordinate actions or anything like that for the most part. I've really come to the same kind of conclusion, and it's very inspiring. I would say I wrote an essay a few years ago saying that these are the north and south poles of a new compass of revolution, in terms of sort of the maximum expressions of utopia, except it's real. So with that said, John has very in-depth chapters in his book on both the Zapatistas and the Kurdish freedom movement. So Karen wants to know if you could talk a little bit more about feminism and matriarchy in those contexts, John, as you see it.
Right, and yeah, I know we have very little time left. But
sorry.
No, I appreciate the fact that you did what you did, because then I don't have to do it. You already did it so well. I would like to recommend Dylan Fitzwater's book, Autonomy is in Our Hearts, which is about the Zapatistas. And he was actually a senior at Hampshire College, did his senior thesis, went down to Chiapas several times, spent a lot of time listening to people, recording their stories. And he did a wonderful book in which really the indigenous people speak through his book. And it's very beautiful. And it very much shows how the values that, for instance, are expressed in the Tzotzil language and the practices of the indigenous people are very matricentric. They question our whole patriarchal, I think, capitalist, statist, and patriarchal system of values that we have inherited. And yeah, this has had a tremendous influence on me, because it's the real world. That humanity has a history of living in solidarity, basically. And there are still people living on this planet who have a continuous relationship to that historic practice. And there's so much that we can learn from them. So that's one thing that I would recommend, just to look at the evidence that's there of the possibility of a non-patriarchal sensibility. And the concepts that Dylan Fitzwater emphasizes in his book are well, I call it a politics of heart and spirit, because heart and spirit are two of the central concepts that the indigenous people use in that culture. And there's a complete, and of course, you know, the question is, what is this legacy of hierarchy, domination, oppression, and to what extent is it all a transformation of patriarchal values and the original form of oppression, which was the enslavement of women. This is something, by the way, to transition to Rojava, that Abdullah Öcalan discusses at length in his book. And I might mention, we have a study group right now on his book, The Sociology of Freedom. In fact, this afternoon from 2 to 4 Central Time, we'll be doing a discussion of our third reading selection from his work, which you're about to see. If anybody's interested in joining us, you could still do that if you just send an email to me. You can use my own email, clark@loyno.edu, if you'd like to join us. But the practice in Rojava is quite extraordinary, and in many ways it's a much more deeply revolutionary practice than most of the revolutions that we look to as our paradigm, in large part because of the position of women in that revolution. You know, it's a story that I think has gotten a lot of attention on a superficial level because the women's militias have been so effective and successful. But there's been a real transformation of the entire society in which a concern for ecology, a concern for grassroots participatory democracy, and to some degree a cooperative economy has been combined with, perhaps more effectively than anything else, an attempt to destroy patriarchal values and create an equitable system in which not only women are, you know, in this kind of liberal sense, represented equally, but women have their own institutions and create a paradigm. And this is one of the most striking things, that in many cases, men are sent to the women's militias to learn how they work, because there's so many things that they can't learn anywhere else. So there's much that I could say, but I think that one fact tells you so much about the Rojava Revolution. Quincy, I'm sure you have a lot more to say about this.
No, that's fine. I mean, I think all these subjects we could go on at great length about, and I'm happy to communicate with anybody on this list. I think something that John and I have in common is that we are always looking for new people to work with. And this isn't just an academic exercise with us. We're really trying to do stuff. And there was a question here from our friend Jim Fleming, which I wanted to make sure that you got a chance to answer as we come to the end here, which is just about what you're doing about Bayou La Terre. Maybe since we're towards the end here, I could just frame the question a little bit with, I think, one of the more powerful. I guess I should say too that I've had the opportunity to visit there myself far too briefly. I was just sort of a tourist, but I got a chance to stay the night. And you know, John is not just writing books; he's reforested. How many acres?
Well, we have 88 acres. There were 40 acres that were clear cut, which
now are forest again.
3,500 trees, and I can tell you half of those 3,500 I put in the ground personally. I got help with the others. But most of the reforesting is being done by the forest itself as the forest matures. Right. And actually, even though I planted 3,500 trees, many more than 3,500 grew on their own. So you know, that's a wonderful part of the project. Over 30 years, I've watched the forest regenerate largely from being a pine plantation to becoming what it wants to become. Right. With a little bit of help.
Let me, if it's possible, I'd just like to pose one last big question in the context of La Terre. One of the things that I struggle with, I thought about it all day today, and you frame it so disarmingly and forcefully in your book, is you talk about denial and disavowal. Right. And you talk about is you have this great line where, so denial is where you just deny there's a problem. And then disavowal is where you know there's a problem, but you pretend you don't know. You
act as if you don't know.
You act as if you don't.
Actions betray.
Or your action is completely disproportionate to the problem. And then you have this great line that's why we have a two-party system in the United States, one for the deniers and one for the disavowers. I'd like you to, I think the answer in a way is what you're doing in La Terre is what you're doing. I want to let you answer it yourself. But I think in this coronavirus and even before the coronavirus, with catastrophic climate change, with police violence, with the biggest gold mine in the world, we all have this problem, man. And like we know, but we act like we don't know.
Right.
Help us out here. How can we stop doing that?
Okay, well, one thing I was just thinking about is that, you know, the title of the book is Between Earth and Empire, from the Necrocene to the Beloved Community. And we've talked to a certain extent about the Earth, to a certain extent about empire, certainly about empire as expressed on the cover of that book. And with Rojava and Chiapas, the Zapatistas, Cooperation Jackson, about the beloved community, but we haven't talked a lot about the Necrocene. And I don't think our discussion has exhibited the kind of maybe trauma that we need to experience in the face of global ecological collapse, which is certainly imminent. Certainly, we haven't talked about geohistory, which is a big topic in the book, living in geohistory. If we live in geohistory, and if we can even think in geohistory, this is what is really looming, much more so, you know, in a sense, the coronavirus is a symptom. There are many other symptoms. But the big picture is about that coming collapse. And I mean, I could use a lot of metaphors on what kind of boxcars we're on, headed toward what, and so forth. And we're still talking about, is it like we're living in our apartments in Berlin or something, you know? And we're not. Just like in France 24 this morning, in somebody's house, capitalism is everywhere. The Necrocene is everywhere. You know, we're living in it. It pervades everything. And we haven't gotten into a lot of philosophical kind of talk, but one of the things I've thought a lot about is, you know, there's this famous concept of being toward death that a certain philosopher popularized. And I think we have to think about that a lot. And also we have to think about being toward life. We have a different kind of sensibility if we focus only on being toward death and not being toward life, but maybe above all, being toward birth. And this is again where the maternalism comes in. In all traditional cosmologies, they've really been about birth and rebirth. And our cosmology is really about death and ultimate death. It's about turning everything into, you know, dead matter, really, objectifying everything, reifying everything, taking the living reality out of everything. And as you take the living reality out of every individual thing, you end up taking the living reality out of the biosphere and the living earth. And that's really the big picture. That's really what it's about. That's really what needs to mobilize us and motivate us. Unless we're wrong about the possibility of any hope. And I realize that in a sense, the enemy is nihilism. I mean, even friends of mine like to call themselves nihilists, and they, you know, some of them are not really nihilists, but they use the word. But there is a kind of nihilistic ideology that is very powerful, and there's a nihilistic imaginary that's very powerful. And before I called it the Necrocene, which I decided to call it because it seemed like the scariest word I could think of, I was calling it the Thanatocene. And I like that term because in a sense, it focuses on the great struggle being between Eros and Thanatos. And in a certain sense, if we accept the traditional patriarchal model of reality, in a certain sense, eros versus thanatos is the feminine versus the masculine. You know, it really is. I mean, that's not what the ideology says, but that's what the ideology disguises, because ultimately thanatos becomes embodied in the masculine and the masculine becomes dominant. And this is one reason why I think Rojava is so important, because somehow, these are two great stories, Chiapas and Rojava, because they're both cases in which Marxist Leninist militants were converted. The Zapatistas, you know, were the people who came there, the militants who came to convert the natives, were converted by the indigenous people, and they gave up their Eurocentric patriarchal ideology. And in Rojava, somehow, Öcalan, who ended up on his island, which is very ironic because in a certain sense, the whole world opened up to him on that island. And he ultimately questions patriarchy more than he questions anything else in the history of what he calls the central civilization, the civilization of domination. So that's the big story, and it's the big story, and it's also the story that each of us is living out in our own personal life, and in our family life, and in our small group life.
Thank you, John. I don't know, are we allowed to keep going? I think we are over time. But,
we are. I just wanted to
we're always
mention,
out of time.
I didn't say anything. Jim mentioned La Terre Institute, which
Yes,
you
please.
followed up. But what I would like to say, if anybody's interested in the Öcalan group or La Terre Institute, send me an email at clark@loyno.edu, and we can communicate about that. And basically, La Terre Institute needs something more than anything else, which is a community of people working together on behalf of its mission, which is described on our Facebook page and also our website, laterreinstitute.org.
Fantastic. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
I really hope that this was recorded. I think I heard it would be, and I hope we can share this with others. I know I personally want to listen again to what John said. And I think we all, you know, when we all are faced with nihilism, I know that it's whether it's in consumerism or it's in people who've been defeated and need to start over, whatever it is, I am always particularly, what usually gets me out of the hole is talking to people that are inspiring. That make me feel better about being human, and remind me that the mind is a beautiful thing, and that so much is possible in a single lifetime. And
Could I say something in response? That's why I asked you to do a conversation. It is, and why I didn't want to do it by myself, because I totally agree with that, and that I would certainly not have done the same things. And you know, you add so much and you make so many things possible when we have these conversations. So I'm so grateful.
okay. Thanks, everybody. And if you want to know more about Kurdistan or the Zapatistas, we didn't talk at all about the Sarvolia movement in Sri Lanka. There's so many things. Please get John's book. And both John and I put our email addresses in the thing. Thanks so much for everybody who's commented to the Anarchist Book Fair. And yeah, we're look forward to being in touch with all of you.
Thank you so much, John and Quincy. This was a really incredible discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks to everybody. I wish I could talk to each of you.
Yeah.
Maybe we can do that in the future.
Okay. Sadly, we go.
That's fine. Thank you very much.
Hi, David.
Thanks,
Thanks for the comment.